shall I start? أبدي ولا أبلش بالسيشن ولا لازم ينتظر الستاف يجي؟ طب مين الستاف؟ مين الستاف اللي مسؤول عنه؟ So, hi everyone, welcome to the last session of the day. So hopefully you still have a little bit of energy to hear what we will be discussing today. Shahad Mustafa, I'm the regional coordinator of ILC and the EMENA region, of course, and I will be moderating this session today with colleagues from ILC and FAO. The session objective will be, of course, tackling the outcomes of the Rio Convention, the UNCCD and the UNCBD, and discuss the proposed indicators by the UNCBD, as well as the how this would be translated into the national action plans, and highlight the potentiality for partnership in the Arab region, and also what role can civil society play in that, and the data sources that could be used to back up reporting on CBD indicators. We all know that last year there was two major conventions, UNCCD, UNCBD, in Riyadh and also in Colombia, where many issues were discussed, where many decisions were made in terms of reporting on indicators and having indicators, and finally tenure security was addressed in these conventions. The region, and why it's important that we bring these outcomes to this conference today, because we have a region that is basically formed by rangeland, which makes 1/6 of the food supply, and it also has a storage of the 1/3 of the carbon market in its soils, and 50% of it is degraded in the last couple years. And just to take out from the session that I was just in, by 2025, which is this year, we are losing 25% of arable land because of the degradation and as an outcome of the climate change and lack of action to restore ecosystems. So to start, I would like to highlight that the CBD and the CCD, they are emerging as important spaces to recognize the crucial role that land tenure security can play, and also the work that was going between ILC and FAO together to develop the indicator. And at UNCCD, there was a success point where we managed to gain some further consolidation in discussions to advance the work on land tenure as part of the convention. So we will discuss the key outcomes today, and I'm just gonna move to my colleague Eva, who will lead the presentation, data, and Landex, and the indicator on the UNCBD.
Okay, thanks, Shad. I hope you're hearing me well, and if we can put on the PowerPoint, we'll just start to walk through that. So I'm Eva Hershaw. I'm the Land Monitoring and Data Lead at the International Land Coalition. We're a member-based coalition with our secretariat in Italy, in Rome. We have more than 300 members, closer to 350, I think now, across more than 84 countries. So we're a diverse member-based coalition, and much of the work that we do to monitor land governance and to work through indicators with our members to generate data on land governance is with the goal of helping them to be involved in the monitoring process, right? And that's certainly true of the evolving frameworks that we're seeing around the CBD and the UNCCD. So slides when we're ready. We had a unique, thank you, next slide. We had a unique opportunity in the CBD framework that has been evolving over the last 2 years. So it's been more than 2 years that we've been pushing for a land tenure indicator and really for land tenure to be recognized in the monitoring framework that CBD was developing. Next slide. Perfect. Okay, I hope I can continue reading this, but I should know what I'm saying, so it should be enough. So the Kunming-Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework was a framework that was developed around 23 targets and a number of goals, and it's not dissimilar from the SDG monitoring framework in the sense that there were broad aspirational targets and goals, and the CBD had set out between the last COP and this one to build a monitoring framework that would provide measurable concrete indicators that could measure progress towards these targets. So the links between biological and cultural diversity have long been recognized in the CBD space. And so when we came in looking at this framework with a land tenure lens, there was a lot of work that had already been done in the Article 8J working group, but also in the development of 4 traditional knowledge indicators, one of which was on land tenure and use in indigenous and traditional territories. So while that indicator existed, the CBD had recognized it as one of its 4 key indicators of traditional knowledge. There was no methodology, right? Next slide. Oh, sorry. It's late, I'm sorry. This will probably happen again. So we had in Target 22 clear language that was calling for a recognition of the role that land rights played in the conservation of biodiversity, but there was no indicator. So fast forward over 2 years, and it's fast forwarding over quite a lot of negotiation and details that had to be sorted out. But thanks to the work that had been done on the traditional knowledge indicators, the opportunity that the language about land rights and the strong focus on indigenous peoples and local communities in the framework, and the gap, there being no headline indicator for Target 22, we were able to propose an indicator that could fill that gap. And the outcome of COP16, and then we'll walk a little bit through the process, we now have a proposed headline indicator that would ask parties, it would be a required indicator if retained as a headline indicator, to monitor land tenure on the land and territories of indigenous peoples and local communities. Many of the states are doing this already, some are not, but the indicator would be a clear directive for them to do so. An additional outcome of COP16 that's very relevant for the work that we do in the land community, there were a number of headline indicators. So again, these are the required indicators that parties will be reporting on in their next CBD national reports that saw optional disaggregations being added. And they're optional, so they're not imposed. But a number of headline indicators, and you can see here for Target 2 around restoration, and then Target 3 around protected areas. They're calling for this data, wherever it can be, to be disaggregated by tenure type. So showing where restoration is happening by type of tenure, showing which areas are protected also by type of tenure in order to account for the land that's being restored and protected that's under the care of indigenous and local communities. So we started, and it's cruel to talk about indicators and SDGs at this hour, but you came to this session and presumably have an interest. But there were 3 SDG land indicators that set a very important precedent for the work that we hope to do with other partners in the CBD space. I won't detail these, but SDG 142, which is a measure of land tenure, secure land tenure, 5A1, which looks at women in the agricultural population, and 5A2, which measures the strength of the legal framework for women's land rights. These were the starting points, and it was actually very important for CBD that indicators being proposed were existing, so they were in operation, and that they already had a community of practice around them. The SDGs clearly provided that and allowed us to enter with land tenure, and then adopt it in a way that made it more suitable for the CBD space. There are limitations of these 3 SDG indicators, which we know well. And in fact, for 142, despite this being an indicator of secure land tenure, we cannot see indigenous peoples or local communities in any of the data sets that have been published for this indicator. It's not to say that parties are not collecting this data, it's not being published, and certainly not in a comprehensive way or systematically across the indicator. So we couldn't see the kind of tenure systems that we wanted to highlight in a biodiversity context. For 5A1, this was an indicator that did have some data, not a ton, but was limited to the agricultural context, which of course is not showing us the full rural context. And 5A2 was a legal-based indicator, so while this has been retained, in fact all of them have been retained as non-mandatory indicators in the CBD monitoring framework, they provided this starting point for us to work with. So the traditional knowledge indicators, as I said, in 2016, the CBD approved 4 traditional knowledge indicators, one on language diversity, one on traditional occupations, one on participation, and a 4th, which was our starting point, that was land tenure and use in indigenous and traditional communities. So there are 2 parts to that indicator. You can't measure land tenure and land use in the same way. So we broke it into 2 sub-indicators that you can see here, looking at land use change, how land is being used, and then of course change indicates you're monitoring that over time. And land tenure would need to adapt in order to not look only at individuals and the titles that they held, but how secure indigenous territories and local communities or customarily managed lands were. So this is a quick overview of land and its relevance to the targets and the goals of the CBD monitoring framework. I wouldn't go through all of these now, but to say that land, as we see, is not only relevant to Target 22, that's where we see clear language calling for secure tenure rights or land rights to be considered in the achievement of the target, but it's relevant to a number of other indicators, and this is recognized by the framework calling for the data to be disaggregated by tenure type. So land is embedded and across these multiple targets and goals. So I said that we started from SDG 142, and you can see here the modifications that we needed to make. So rather than looking at the proportion of individuals that had a document showing their individual rights to land, we instead translated this into an indicator that would look at hectares. So it would be looking at the proportion of hectares that are being used or managed by indigenous peoples and local communities, and the proportion of those which were secured or recognized by the government. Likewise, the perception half of SDG 142, this again would be projected onto an area-based indicator rather than an individually based measurement of tenure security. So we recognize that different data was available at different levels, and that states would likely be would have access to different kinds of data when we were starting. So we developed a stage-based approach which would allow countries to report against this indicator, but using the data that they had at hand. So if that was precise geo-referenced maps, that would work. If it was a nationally indicative number that fulfilled the indicator, that would also work. So it was recognizing that the most widely available data is not always the most precise, but we shouldn't wait for the most precise possible data in order to start reporting on this indicator. It was an indicator that we built in order to accommodate different data sources. So again, in contrast to the SDG experience, which put the burden, but the requirement of data collection with the governments, here we saw an opportunity to pull in different data sources, so non-traditional data, geospatial data, satellite imagery, but also third-party complementary data sets. So the Prindex data set, for example, also community-based monitoring initiatives. So it was an indicator that could accommodate data coming from different sources that could even act in a complementary way. Here, again, you'll see that as we approach this in a phase-based way because the least precise data was the most available. So you could see that if we needed to report on this indicator tomorrow, we would have data for about 130 countries across these two sub-indicators. If we went to the most precise community-level geospatial, the geo-reference data, the amount of countries shrank considerably. Both are valid numbers, and it's a starting point. But we needed to recognize that there were different kinds of data and different qualities of data. We did a similar thing for the land use indicator, and FAO was instrumental in doing this work. So again, here we had two SDGs, 15.1.1 and 15.4.2, that guided us in the sense that they had metadata and established methods that worked in order to calculate similar variables. What we did was look both at forest areas, so the proportion of land that was being held or used by local communities and indigenous people that was forested, but that wasn't the most inclusive measurement. So we, not in all contexts, in some contexts where the country is not heavily forested, a natural land estimate of that same area would reflect non-forested area that's clearly contributing to biodiversity. That's important in a region like the Arab region, where of course forested land is not the only way to represent the biodiversity stock. This is unfortunately an example from Colombia and not from the Arab region, but this shows you how we would calculate this indicator. You see that according to data, in this case it's government data that's being showcased through the platform Landmark, that 82% of all land that's held and used by indigenous people and local communities is recognized by the government. That might seem like a high number or a low number. We can then also look at the national level data set from Prindex, and we can see that 67% of rural residents in the country perceive their tenure to be secure. So this is a different data source, but it's giving us another element of that indicator. And finally, if we look at natural lands, so the proportion of lands held or used by indigenous peoples or local communities that is natural land is 97%. If you look at forested land only, that drops to 80-some%. It anyway gives you an indication of the way that land is being managed, being used in those indigenous territories and land that's being held by local communities. So next steps. This was kind of the background in order to achieve the indicator that we now have in a draft decision that will be put to the parties at the resumed COP16 that will take place at the end of the month. So we're waiting for that indicator to be confirmed. If that indicator is confirmed as a headline indicator, FAO, which has been identified as the custodian of that indicator, working together with ILC, with Forest Peoples Program, other members of the technical reference group that developed the indicator, will then need to fully operationalize it. This will mean getting inputs from parties. It's important that this indicator can be used by governments and is applicable in all of their contexts. And then begin rolling out the indicator and really developing a data flow and working process that would allow countries to use it in their national reporting processes. Thank you.
Thanks, Eva. Now we're going to move to Ward Ancia, who's going to share with us how the outcomes of CBD and the momentum built around it could be translated in the CCD, and how land tenure could be capitalized in the upcoming years in the UNCCD commitments.
Yeah, I will stand because impossible for me to read that screen. So I'll have to look on this one. This one is big enough. No, the green, okay. So I will do something very similar than what Eva did, but for UNCCD. So the COP CBD was in October, the COP UNCCD was in December. And although UNCCD is much more advanced with its monitoring framework, they're still being under discussion in CBD. For UNCCD, it exists already for a couple of years. They've actually been in the phase 5 of monitoring, so 5 years or more than 5 years down the road. The land indicator within that monitoring system in UNCCD is much less developed. So although we engage in very similar activities, because of this context and the evolution of the two monitoring frameworks, the activities we engage in and how we engage in with the parties and the stakeholders in these processes are totally different. And so what we did here for UNCCD is first to have a look, where can we input land? How can we put land and land tenure more prominently within the framework? And very quickly coming out of that was that it's not only in the monitoring framework, the last bit that I show you there, I'll come to that, but it's also at the other phases of activities and implementation of UNCCD, where we can put land in and that would contribute in positioning land tenure within the UNCCD framework. The first one is here on the left, is through all the national activities that the countries are engaged in for the implementation of UNCCD, whether that's through their national action plans, through their drought plans, or their voluntary national LDN targets, etc. Quite easily, there would be an opening there to input land tenure in there through a baseline of tenure assessment within these, through voluntary national targets on land, but it depends on the country there to implement, to integrate them and implement that. But that's one way how, beyond the monitoring framework of UNCCD, the global one, that we could input their land tenure in their framework. The second one is that project support or program support. So on top of the national initiatives that UNCCD implements, there's also country support through various UNCCD and other initiatives, such as the joint one between UNCCD and FAO, which will be presented by Brad hereafter. And so there we could implement, integrate quite easily through these new programs, through new funding popping up on a continuous basis, again, land elements, land indicators, land routes, etc. I will explain. And then, of course, the monitoring in the monitoring framework, the very similar way as Eva has presented for CBD. There's a couple of points I want to make, and in comparison with the CBD where we stand for UNCCD. And the first one is the timeline of ongoing reporting processes. As I said, This is already a well-functioning process. Reporting has been ongoing. So we are coming here with a new indicator. So opening up that box, that monitoring box that exists. It's the same question for CBD, although a bit early in the process. And parties have been looking at that and saying, should we open up, should we not open up? And here it's even a bit more complicated because it has been ongoing for a couple of cycles already. And so through the discussions we had at COP in Riyadh, it was said that implementing now or integrating now land indicators would be impossible because they engaged from January this year already the new reporting process. So coming now with new indicators when states have already prepared for their reporting was a no-go. But they said in 2026, for 2026, possible of minor changes that could be integrated. Now, of course, what is minor? This is to be seen with the parties, and this is the process we engaged in, similar to CBD. There will be a review of the monitoring process in 2030. A full review of the monitoring process. And there's more openings, possibilities of integrating land tenure there. And this, again, is to be developed. What type of indicators? Very similar to CBD. Good to know that land, as for CBD, land tenure was adopted at COP14, but has never been integrated. Lack of methodologies was part of the reason. And different to CBD is that in the case of UNCCD, we requested by the Secretariat to take that reflection onwards. So it's not through certain policy, through certain political mechanisms like in CBD. Here it's really a request by the Secretariat to say, well, it was adopted in COP14, which was in 2020 or 19. Let's take that work forward. So how can we do that? And then the very similar process at CBD. One last point I want to make here is that unlike in CBD, the focus we felt in Riyadh was less on indigenous peoples and local community lands only, but it's more on the negative hotspots of desertification. It's not what is the positive contribution of indigenous peoples to biodiversity, how can we reverse the negative consequences of land use, etc., for UNCCD. And that shifts a little bit the target from only indigenous peoples and local community lands to also all the other lands that are affected by desertification. And here we mainly speak about people-made impacts on land, so private land, but also public lands, etc. So although indigenous peoples and local communities are part of the process, there were discussions around how to integrate other types of tenure systems, whether public, whether private, to have a broader perspective on these dynamics. So very quickly, coming back to the qualitative options, I won't go in detail because I want to complement Eva's presentation on indicator. So here, integrating of land tenure in the implementation framework. So the UNCCD strategy framework is composed of 3 parts: a vision, a strategic, and an implementation framework, which is accompanied by a qualitative monitoring survey, which is run every year. And there, it was very easy to open up. It's informal, it's more informal based, it's not as structured. It's run by the Secretariat itself to integrate land tenure aspects. I won't say indicators, but aspects, questions, variables. And this was done already through negotiations within the UNCCD Secretariat and consultations they had with certain of the stakeholders. They integrated these aspects. Secondly, through the national voluntary targets, as I mentioned to you in the first slide, we could bring in land tenure into these targets through a technical guide on the VGTs, through other elements, and identifying pathways, as they call them, towards more integration of land tenure in their framework. And this also could be done quickly, could be done easily from now on already. Now, coming back to the indicators and to complement Eva's presentation, Whereas CBD has a large number of targets, CCD works around strategic objectives. They have 3 with sub-objectives within there. Not going to go through all of them. 4 are important, 3 are important here. The first one is the green one, which is trends in land cover, because that's also land use, and that's the very similar one that Eva highlighted for CBD, so there's a common point there, and you will understand why I highlight that. And then the red one, which is trends, which includes trends in land cover, SO2 trends in land productivity, and SO3 trends in carbon stocks, which forms SDG 15.3.1, of which UNCCD is the custodian. So as was the process for CBD, where we try to align the indicators for CBD with the SDGs, in this case, in Eva's case, 1.4.2. Here, they seemed already a natural link with SDG 15.3.1 because UNCCD is the custodian of that indicator and is being already nationally and locally implemented through the UNCCD processes. So what options are there? What options did we see and what options did we put to the table to be discussed in Riyadh during the COP? And the first one, of course, is a tenure disaggregation of the SDG 15.3.1. Logically, they the custodians already, they implemented already. They told us, or during the discussions, it was discussed that we should cover the various tenure systems, whether it's indigenous peoples, whether it's private, whether it's public, etc. So quite easily, related to the work that we do in CBD, the collection on indigenous peoples data, we could then implement the same thing, but for 15.3.1. The pros, easily justifiable because it's their indicator. The limiting factor here is the tenure data, whereas now we are generating quite a bit of data around indigenous peoples and local community data. A global database on private lands does not exist, but there the states should and would in most of the cases have through their cadastres and farm registries, etc. Now when we come to public land, it becomes more complicated. States do not know where their public lands are. It's a very difficult question. We have them for protected areas, etc., but in general, we don't know. It's very difficult. We're trying to assess that. We're trying to develop a global map on that. It is very difficult. Even in the countries where the cadastre systems, etc., are the most developed, like, for example, in Western Europe, etc., we try to find out what the percentage of public lands was in France. Impossible to find out. Through deduction, we could, but for that, you need access to your private land systems and your indigenous peoples' land system to get then, by deduction, your public land systems. And if the 2 first ones do not exist, obviously the 3rd one does not exist. But easily to implement otherwise, surely easily acceptable by UNCCD. Voilà. The second option, and that was based on the discussions in Riyadh, which were very focused on human-induced land degradation patterns. And here we would relate that to the various tenure systems. Human-induced land degradation data is available and could be then superposed to the land tenure in data that we talked about for CBD and for option 1. The pros data is available. There is information now more and more being worked on by UNCCD, and it is a high priority area of work for UNCCD. It was very much illustrated during the COP in Riyadh. Now, this means opening up their monitoring framework, because this would be a new indicator for their monitoring framework related to land, a medium one, because it is high priority, but we still would have to justify that. Option 3, it's then align 100% to what Eva presented, to SDG 1.4.2. And that the importance here is to align with the other SDGs. So here it would be very same one. The only difference, if I see where the discussions in UNCCD are going is not to cover only indigenous peoples' land, but also public lands and private lands. But this would just be broadening that initial database. So the pro here, it's very much alignment with the other frameworks, in this case CBD, and why not UNFCCC and the SDGs, of course. But the con here is a high level of opening up of their framework, because 1.4.2 is not integrated in their monitoring framework. The good thing is, since it would be aligned, the data would be created across the Rio conventions. And then lastly, there's a couple of other indicators we are all working on. ILC is working with Prindex, etc., on a rangeland indicator, which would be very relevant for UNCCD as well. There's gender indicators. It's one of the hot topics in UNCCD at the moment. So there's other options there. But again here, this would be opening up entirely the framework. So just to conclude, where to focus? Well, I would think that we should focus on both the non-indicator and the indicator one, so the qualitative and quantitative one. Why do we work on these indicators? It's really to institutionalize land tenure within these climate and biodiversity related frameworks. It can of course be done through the indicators, because that pushes the states to report on it, but it also, these other openings, the more qualitative ones, are certainly a route to consider. Now, which indicators? Very much necessary, and the discussions in Riyadh showed it, and even in plenary sessions, I'm not sure if some of you, I know some of you were there, but remember that the parties said, we need alignment. It's enough indicators. We have 200 plus indicators of the SDGs. We have several targets with several indicators of CBD. We have so many targets for UNCCD. We don't have the capacity to report on all these indicators. And the push of alignment came from the parties. The European Union stood up and mentioned that it was not only alignment of the indicators, it was also alignment of the platforms, the integration of the platforms. That we don't have 25 platforms to report on in all these frameworks. So all this should start talking to each other. And that's why the 1.4.2 one is although it opens up the framework, is certainly not to be disregarded. What is possible? What is accessible? I think here we are in the framework of an incremental process. Let's push for the qualitative options straight away, and some have been done. The implementation framework has been integrated, the land tenure indicators have been integrated already by the Secretariat itself. And then try to push for a disaggregation option for indicator 15.3.1. It is adopted. UNCCD is the custodian. I think with a little bit of effort and consultations of the parties, we could legitimize and show them the relevance of a land tenure disaggregation of that indicator they're working on. And then for 2030, integrate some of these other indicators, whether it's 1.4.2 or the rangelands one, etc., through both more lengthy consultations with the parties and co-construction with the parties. I think that would be possible. It's a long time to go, but time flies.
Thanks, Ward. I think that highlighted what's at stake for the upcoming years and what's for our partners and ILC and FAO to think of, to develop and integrate to meet the expectation of the Secretariat by 2030. May I move to you, Brad, and ask you if you could tell us a little bit on the joint initiative on national dialogues for integration of land tenure?
Thank you very much. Good evening, everyone. Thanks for being here for this, what we think is a very important session. My name is Brad Patterson. I'm a land tenure specialist with the Food and Agriculture Organization. I'm based in the regional office for Europe and Central Asia, which is in Hungary. the regional office has sort of coverage or works in countries in Europe, the Caucasus, and Central Asia. And if we could have the presentation. I'm here kind of presenting on behalf of my colleague Aurélie Bress, who was not able to attend. So she should be getting the credit for the presentation, and at the same time, any omissions, she should be taking the blame for them as well. So it's a pleasure to be here and to share with all of you. I think this is a kind of a manifestation or reflection of the importance of land tenure and how it's been increasingly recognized. For many years, there was a stream of work on land tenure, but now to integrate tenure and tenure considerations into other areas, such as climate change and biodiversity, land degradation, land restoration, it's showcasing, or it's showing that that land tenure solutions are also solutions for climate change and for land degradation and these other areas. So it's a real sort of proof that that the work on land tenure is fundamental and very much important. So just briefly for some context, globally about 1.66 billion hectares of land are affected by human-induced degradation, and over 60% of this degradation occurs on agricultural lands. And this directly compromises the productivity of cropland and of pastures as well. And so restoring degraded agricultural land is necessary and is vital for sustainable and more productive agri-food systems. I think there's a slide missing. I will blame Aurélie. So this is just to give some more context. Through the monitoring of SDG 1.4.2, the latest sort of assessment indicated that 21 out of 33 countries, in 21 of those 33 countries, less than half of the population has legally recognized documentation for their land tenure rights. On top of that, there's a glaring inequality in terms of land concentration, where 84% of farms worldwide are less than 2 hectares in size, and account only 12% of the world's agricultural land use. And as a stark contrast, just 1% of farms control 70% of this land. On top of those inequalities, of course, there are gender disparities, where in the majority of places, men are enjoying greater ownership, more control, more secure land tenure rights in the agricultural sector. And on top of that, on top of those types of disparities, the fact that between 40 and 50% of the world's land is occupied by indigenous peoples and local communities. However, only 10% of this land is legally recognized as being under their ownership. And finally, 1 billion people believe that they are at risk of eviction from their homes or land within the next 5 years. And so this situation, this picture that I painted is one that shows the challenges, but I'm also going to show that part of the work that my colleagues previously presented and the work of FAO and UNCCD are trying to address those challenges. So this is where the sort of the genesis of this initiative between FAO and the UNCCD, United Nations Convention to Combat Desertification. Partly what Ward had presented in the past, kind of the origins. I won't go through in so much detail, but just to say that it's been a work coming since at least 2019, where land tenure was officially kind of acknowledged and in a decision of the Conference of the Parties. FAO also then was tasked with developing, along with the UNCCD Secretariat, a technical guide to integrate the VGGT, that's the voluntary guidelines on the responsible governance of tenure of land, fisheries, and forests in the context of national food security, with the work of the UNCCD. So this is a guide. It's available in 6 languages, and I will present a little bit about it. But this is part of the path and the partnership and the acknowledgement of the real need to work on land tenure solutions for land degradation and land restoration. Further along, other decisions at previous COPs, and then here I'm showing the joint initiative of FAO and the UNCCD, where we supported, or the joint initiative supported, national consultations to see, okay, we have the Conference of the Parties mentioning the importance. We have a technical guide. But what does this mean at the country level? What does it mean when we put actors together who work in these sectors? How would that look in one country? It's good to have these frameworks and the guidelines, but when we come to the country level, we want to see how that would look. And part of this process were these national consultations. Very, very briefly about, just to explain that part of the framing of the implementation of tenure and the work of the UNCCD through the technical guide. The technical guide has a number of pathways to try to highlight or guide in what areas of work and what topics could we see this type of integration. And so there are 9 pathways in total, everything from legal policy and legal frameworks to securing women's tenure rights, to supporting land degradation neutrality through land administration tools, including land consolidation. I take this opportunity just to say that for those that are still here tomorrow, at this time there will be an interesting session on multi-purpose land consolidation and what it can mean for the Arab region. That'll be in the Olive Room tomorrow at this time. But it's part of the solution. It's part of the topics of where this integration can be fulfilled, and other pathways as well, with common lands, private land, etc. So there were in the first round there were national consultations in 5 countries, in Sri Lanka, in Kenya, in Mexico, in Senegal, and myself, I helped to organize the national consultation in Kazakhstan. And so I'm just going to take a couple of minutes to talk about or just to highlight some of the lessons learned, and as well as the recommendations that came from all 5 of those national consultations. And so some of these are perhaps obvious, but it's important to say that this is what came from the consultations. The consultations, of course, were done in a multi-stakeholder manner, bringing various ministries together, as well as civil society organizations, academia, the private sector, other international organizations. And so the multi-stakeholder nature, of course, is to try to make sure that all the voices are being heard. And so some of the lessons you can see here, I won't go one by one, but just to say that they all felt that it was important hold these consultations, to hear the voices of the different actors. Some wanted to kind of focus on agroecological zones within their country. Some of them have large countries. Some of them the country has different landscapes, and so perhaps the integration of tenure and combating land degradation could look differently. Again, trying to link these with ongoing projects and programs and initiatives that can further the integration, and then finally the need to continue to raise awareness and develop capacities over linkages between tenure and security and land degradation, kind of echoing what Ward mentioned from the COP in Riyadh, where this is also something that came from the member states, the need to have national focal points on land tenure and more support to integrate. Priority to tenure security and land restoration in land use planning processes. And finally, collective forms of access to land are worth exploring in order to restore land that has been degraded. I leave here just my contact detail, but also of my colleague and some QR codes for some of the publications that are pertinent and were part of the background to this presentation. The work with this joint initiative will continue. The plan is to continue the national consultations in more countries and to further along in the process of the UNCCD and the Conference of the Parties. Thanks for your attention.
Thanks, Bradley. Thanks for the very comprehensive presentation that you have put together. And you have mentioned that one of the recommendations is the consideration of collective systems to be considered, and also the consultations with civil society and their added value, which brings me to the intervention of the civil society side and the role that they are playing on the whole arena of UNCCD and UNCBD, and how this could be translated into a sustainable way towards reporting on the indicators. If someone at the control could play the recording, please. It's from Mariam Jaja. She's from APN, the Arabic Network for Protection of Nature, from Jordan.
الاستيلاء على الأراضي ولكن بنكهة خضراء أي green gravel، ولا يختلف الأمر بما يتعلق باتفاقية الأمم المتحدة.
This has nothing to do with the UNCCD. The problem started at the very beginnings when the aims and indicators are being put. For example, the UNCCD and its indicators and impacts are not responding properly to the aims of our strategy, especially what is related to human rights. And there is a complete lack of the impact of these indicators, and there is no indicators related to food security or decision making, or even the displacement of people. And it does not respond to the work program comprehensively, and this is human-made mostly, such as managing the water or implementing laws for managing lands or even for occupying lands. And regarding the programs, the integration of the civil society is just a formality. And this leads to the non-response of the society's need. And this is a failure. For example, there are massive projects that aims to implement trees that are not fruitful in degraded places in order to combat green gas emission. Even though we can implement plants and trees that can do both. And there are a lot of projects that aims to expand the greenscape in the desert instead of recovering the lands that are deteriorated. And there are a lot of projects that works for the benefit of investors. And this is not going in line with our aims. And in order to reduce green gas emission, we need a lot of lands, and it is almost the surface of agricultural lands in the world. And these green gas emissions, in order to be mitigated and in order to protect the civil societies and its right in agriculture, is not preserved, and this will lead to displacement. And also there is the non-protection of people's right in land tenure, especially through mechanisms of debt exchanging, and this process allows states to omit the debts of other states, and these projects are so expensive, and these massive investments is threatening the security of lands. And a lot of this investment comes to the sector of tourism, and it neglects managing lands. And when we talk about ecosystem services and environmental tourism, it excludes a lot of societies. And what concerns the most the civil society is, for example, the neutral fund related to the degradation of lands. And this is one of the massive funds, for instance, Minova in France, that combat the competitiveness between investors. And this is done digitally instead of social justice, and this is led by an international committee, and we call it a market land task force by discussion. And its role is to evaluate the risks. And because of this fund, we faced a lot of objections and conflict interest. Of course, there is success in regard to the indicators, and the most important is securing land tenure. The latest decision encouraged the collaboration between societies, and the essential challenge that is posed is related to civil societies and different frameworks related to land tenure. Now, the monitoring processes on the national level is depending on reports and indicators that are qualitative and little importance is given to the social and political aspects. One of the most important aspects for us is the food sovereignty and productivity, especially for our Arab lands. And we implement 3,000 trees in Palestine and Jordan, and 500 person is benefiting from this despite of the crimes in Gaza. And we need to combat the armament of the environment and trans-border crimes. And for an operator to come and say that he will buy Gaza and the next day he will say we won't buy anything, we are in our way to control it. This is a systematic thinking of the occupying forces and colonial forces. And we won't let this go like that. Thank you.
Well, I guess thank you, Mariam, at highlighting again the role that civil society can play in terms of drafting at least national action plans and biodiversity action plans that includes local communities and their perspective about ecosystem restoration and stopping the drought in a way that's inclusive and also in the same time empowering local communities considering their social and social economic component. I'm gonna move again to Eva, who will be giving us more information about how Landex is working and how it could be used to contribute to the indicators and the reporting.
Thanks, Shad. If I could have that same presentation that Ward and I used before back up, and I'll be quick. But Miriam set the stage really well for us in the sense that, of course, we're pushing on both ends. So we want these high-level headline indicators to be integrated in the monitoring framework. And we want partnerships to develop that support these indicators, where governments are working with custodians and civil society is very much involved in these processes in order to make sure that they're being represented, that the data and then the qualitative reporting that's surrounding this is being inclusive. But on the other end, if we can make those two ends of the spectrum, ILC has been working for 5 years now with a tool called Landex. And Landex is a global land governance index. This is an index that was built with members. And it's an index that intends to reflect common priorities or common indicators that reflect priorities of land governance. So ILC has an internal framing that it uses across 10 commitments to people-centered land governance. And these indicators that were developed with the members draw data from different sources where it's available. This can be government, this can be complementary data sets, and in many cases, it's citizen-generated data. So this has been something we've been working closely with members in order to ensure that they have the data that they need to monitor various processes that are happening in their countries. In some cases, the data exists. We talk a lot, however, about data gaps, the data that we don't have. And so we've been working with members, we've developed indicators and methodologies to fill those gaps. I don't know if the presentation is coming at this point. Can we put the PowerPoint? Just because it will illustrate what I'm saying more quickly than I can. I can keep talking through it in the meantime. So, thank you. Great. Okay, well, now you know what Landex is. This is the Global Land Governance Index, and this allows us to pull through different data sets and put them on a common scale in a way that gives us a snapshot of land governance in a country in the extent to which it's people-centered, meaning that it's performing well on the indicators that our members defined as crucial to land governance. So Landex, I won't go into this in depth, but suffice it to say there are 33 indicators, and these follow a standard, let's say, human rights-based approach to monitoring. So they look at the structural or legal aspects of a commitment. They look at levels of implementation and then outcomes that are being achieved as a result. As I said, it pulls diverse data sources through. It also, as you can see from the yellow boxes, most of the data that is generated through Landex is generated by people. A number of the existing land monitoring initiatives are also reflected in Landex. So this is very small for me, hopefully bigger for you up here. But Prindex, Landmark, Land Matrix Initiative, we have SDG data coming through. We use methods developed by FAO, the legal assessment tool. We use the Land Portal SOLI Index. We have a joint data set that's developed with Allied. Transparency International's Global Corruption Barometer is also informing one of the indicators. So a lot of the indicators that our members identified as priority indicators were already had been developed by existing initiatives. They were existing data sets. And to go a step further, here you can see the extent to which these indicators speak to the SDGs. We could add an additional slide here showing which of these are speaking now to the CBD framework and to the UNCCD framework. And, well, let's see what's coming next. No, it's stuck. Well, let's see if it's catching up. Commitment 6 that you see here in the middle of the table is a commitment to locally managed ecosystems, which fits very well in the UNCCD and CBD frameworks because we're trying to show outcomes that we achieve when ecosystems, when land is locally managed and tenure is secure. I'm blocked here. I don't know if you can manually force this forward. I'm afraid that things were meant to appear, and that was probably too heavy. Or ran out of... Oh, no, I can go back. But here we go. Okay, so here are some quick examples of the kinds of numbers we can pull through Landex. This is from Jordan. You can see that in 2018, this is the first wave of data collection, but 61% men and women in Jordan had documentation proving their rights to land. If you skip over to a qualitative indicator generated by members of the platform, you see that only 16% of respondents believed that the existing multi-stakeholder platforms on land are accessible and inclusive. We could bounce around further to see attacks on land and environmental defenders. We could see the proportion of land that's managed by local communities that had been recognized. But the gap that we saw was, as I said, around locally managed ecosystems for Commitment 6, and this is where we went about developing new modules that would speak to the CBD and UNCCD. So how are these frameworks being applied on the ground? Governments will be doing their part, we hope, in monitoring these important indicators, but what can civil society add to this? Where is their perspective adding value and uniquely placed to generate data? So to what extent is land tenure accounted for as a pathway to achieving commitments made in the CBD and UNCCD frameworks? We see that land tenure is there. FAO and UNCCD have done a lot of work to make sure that they speak to each other, even defining the pathways. Are those pathways being developed? Are they being budgeted? Are they becoming sustainable at the national level? And then
والسؤال الثاني والذي قد تطرقت إليه مريم أيضا هو ما مدى شمولية هذه العمليات، وهنا يأتي دورنا كأطراف من أجل مراقبة الأراضي سواء فيما يتعلق بالشركات أو المجتمع المدني. وهنالك 3 مؤشرات جديدة تمت إضافتها لنرى ما مدى إمكان إدراجها في الإطار القانوني وكيف تقوم الدول بتطويرها حول هذه الاتفاقيات. ويجب أن تنفذ بشكل فعلي، وأيضا أن تولي الاهتمام للتنوع البيولوجي وما سيتأتى عنه. إذن هذه بعض الأمثلة والأسئلة. هل القانون يدعو إلى التشاور والتعاون بين أصحاب المصلحة والمجموعات المستهدفة في تطوير سياسات لمحاربة التصحر؟ وهل استراتيجيات التنوع البيولوجي للدول تدرج الاعتراف بالحقوق امتلاك الأراضي الجماعية والعرفية؟ وهذا ضروري في إطار المراقبة، وأيضا عندما يجلبون خبراء من أجل توليد بيانات. ومن أجل تفعيل هذا نحن نرى هنا أمثلة أخرى. فهذا إطار جديد، وهل من الممكن أن يتماشى مع اتفاقية التنوع البيولوجي؟ وكيف لنا أن نقوم بتفعيل هذا؟ وأيضا خطة وطنية للعمل. ويمكنكم أن تروا كيف لهذه الأسئلة أن تحدد نوعية العملية إلى حد أو إلى مدى إدراج حق امتلاك الأراضي كمسار للالتزام بهذه الأهداف. وهذه مؤشرات على المخرجات، وننظر إلى مساحة الأرض المتدهورة، وهذا لقد تحدثنا عليه في هدف التنمية المستدامة. وأيضا كيف يتم استعمال الأراضي من طرف الساكنة الأصلية والمحلية من أجل الحفاظ على مستوى التنوع البيولوجي. فإن إسهامات هذه الأراضي والساكنة المحلية يصب في التنوع البيولوجي، ونحن نستعمل هذه البيانات. ولدينا هنا مثال الأردن، فقد سجلت المؤشرات تقييمات من 0 إلى 100، وسهلت استعمال هذه البيانات في الإحاطات السياسية والحملات. وأيضا نحن نستمر في استعمال هذه البيانات من أجل التفاعل مع الحكومات حول ما يتعلق بالتزاماتهم. وهنا أترك لكم رمزا إن أردتم أن تناقشوا بشكل عميق، وأيضا موقع لاندكس. شكرا إيفا. أعلم أن الجميع هنا يودون المغادرة، ولكن إن كان لديكم أي سؤال فنحن مستعدون للإنصات إلى سؤال أو سؤالين. حسنا. أساسا مع أشياء مختلفة، أولها الفروقات وصعوبة تحديد حوكمة الأراضي. إذن فملائمة هذه المؤشرات أمر مهم جدا، ويجب على ما أعتقد هذا قرار عائد إلى مستوى عالي ويجب أن يتم اتخاذه، وهذا بغية التخفيف من العمل، وأيضا من أجل وضع إرشادات ملائمة وثابتة. والنقطة الثانية حول تمليك الأراضي أو حيازتها. في بعض الدول وفي بعض الأحيان الأطر القانونية لا تعطي حق الولوج إلى المعلومات المتعلقة بالمسح والخرائطية والأراضي العامة. أين هي؟ كيف يمكن أن نحددها؟ إن أردنا أن نحددها على الخريطة فهذا أمر صعب للغاية وربما مستحيل. نحن لا نستطيع الولوج إلى كذا معلومة حتى على مستوى المؤسسات العمومية. فعندما نتحدث عن الأطر القانونية من أجل التبليغ بأرض من أجل الاستعمال الجماعي، ومثلا هم عندما نتحدث عن حمى فهذا يتعلق بإدارة موارد الأرض، وهنالك قرار قادم من السلطات المحلية يقول أن هذه المنطقة محددة ونستطيع إدراجها في الخرائط، ولدينا مؤشرات على هذه الأرض، وهذا من أجل إدارة مواردها على مستوى الوطن. وربما نحن في حاجة إلى إعادة إحياء حمى في لبنان وربما في بلدان أخرى. لا أعلم إن كنتم تتفقون معي جميعا، ولكن يجب أن نضع معطيات وتفاصيل دقيقة على الخرائط من أجل مراقبة ما يحدث فيما يتعلق بالتبليغ عن الأراضي وتسجيلها. شكرا. لا أعتقد إن كان لدى أي أحد منكم فكرة حول هذا الجزء، فربما التعريف أو تعريف ما هي الأرض أو السلطة التي تعتقد أن كل معطى عن الأرض قادم من عند مجموعة أو ساكنة محلية أو قانون معين قد يخلق صراعا بين القبائل أو بين شخصين أو مجموعتين محليتين. وقد شهدنا هذا، ربما شهدنا حالة حية في الأردن عندما تعلق الأمر بتحديد الأرض والدولة على دراية تامة بهذا. فنحن نتفق ربما جميعا على أننا بحاجة إلى الخرائط، ونتفق أنه يجب علينا أن نماشي كل مؤشراتنا، وربما هذا قد يخلق صراعا، ولكن هنالك مستويات مختلفة للتحديات في المنطقة والتي يجب علينا أن نواجهها إن كنا نريد أن يكون لدينا نفس المراقبة مثلنا مثل الدول الأخرى، ولكن يجب أن نكون يدا واحدة كمجتمعات من أجل تحديد كيفية عملنا معا ووضع هذه العملية، ربما حتى إن لم نستطع أن نلائم جميع عملياتنا، ولكن أن تكون لدينا نقاط مشتركة ربما عندما يتعلق الأمر باستعمال الأرض أو إلى ما غير ذلك. فنحن ربما نتفق أنه نحن نفتقد لهذا، وقد حان الوقت بالنسبة لنا وشركائنا وحكوماتنا لنسعى إلى طريقة لكيفية تحديد أراضي الساكنة المحلية. شكرا شهد. إن هذا تفاعلي جدا متعلق بحيازة الأراضي، وأنا أتفق بشكل كلي معك. يجب علينا أن نحدد المناطق لتسهيل عمل المؤشرات، وفي نفس الوقت لا يمكننا أن نقول أنه يجب أن ننتظر حتى نتفق. نحن نعترف بأنه حتى في هذه المنطقة لدينا ممارسات جيدة. فعندما تحدث السيد عن حمى في آسيا، فلبنان يجب أن تحدد أراضيها، وربما الأردن أيضا في المناطق الذي تم الحفاظ عليها وإنشاء سياسات. وفي شمال أفريقيا لدينا أجدال، وفي المغرب على سبيل المثال. ولكن حتى إن لم تكن لدينا نفس التسميات للنظام العرفي، لدينا قواعد، وعلى سبيل المثال قاعدة التعاون. وفي تونس ربما لقد تحدثتم عن العمل الغابوي، وفي نيجيريا لدينا أمر مشابه، وأيضا في دول الخليج فيما يتعلق بالأراضي والمجتمعات، وهنالك اتفاقيات وتعاونيات من أجل إدارة هذا. ما أريد أن أذكره هو أنه لمن الجيد أن نبدأ بهذه الممارسات الجيدة من أجل تصعيد هذه الأمور الجيدة، ولا ننتظر حتى يحين وقت ملائم، وهذا لن يحدث أبدا بالخصوص فيما يتعلق بسياق منطقتنا. فلكي نتحرك صوب هدفنا يجب أن نستغل هذه الاستعمالات الجيدة والتي تتواجد مسبقا، والتي سوف تبدي عن كيفية استغلال حيازة الأراضي والحقوق المترتبة عنها. فبالنسبة لوضع الحفاظ على الأراضي في تونس قد بدأ بهكتار واحد، 1000 دونم ما يعادل 10 هكتارات، وهذا ليس بشيء كبير. ففي أول مرة أعطت الحكومة الأراضي للناس لإدارة الحمى فقد نجح هذا، وتغيرت وزارة الزراعة وتغيرت السياسة الداخلية وحتى كيفية الحفاظ على الأراضي بالنسبة للوزارة. إذن فيجب علينا أن نتحرك وأن نستعمل هذه الممارسات الجيدة ونبدي للدول كيف يمكننا أن نبلغ بواسطة آليات عن أراضينا. فبالنسبة لوضعيتنا في المنطقة لن نستطيع التحرك صوب حقوق تمليك الأرض والحقوق المترتبة عنها. أعتقد أننا نتفق بشكل كلي، فهذه الممارسات المحلية وهذه العمليات يجب أن يتم الاعتراف بها أولا، ويجب أن تحسن وتوثق وتشارك على مستوى واسع. فعندما نحاول معايرة هذه المؤشرات على المستوى العالمي سوف أسأل هل من الممكن أن نغطي جميع المبادرات ما إذ كانت حمى أو غيرها، وكيف يمكننا أن نمعيرها ونوثقها وألا نشوهها وألا ننتظر أن يتم تحديدها بشكل من الأشكال من أجل ضمان أنها قد حسنت وطورت من أجل المراقبة أيضا لهذه المبادرات. إذن فأنا أتفق بشكل كلي. فقط لتسليط الضوء على التوثيق بما أنك ذكرته.
Collaboration with FAO, we have the community of practice case studies where we document where case studies are proving that local managed land can be a successful and sustainable solution. So it's probably a call before everything that we need to do more in this regard. And it could be the way where we bring different stakeholders at one table with the civil society and the local communities to have a better impact on the ground. But yeah, it's the starting point. Hopefully it will be only one step towards more structured reporting on indicators.
Yeah, can I say one more thing, Fida, on this? It's also our task to make sure that governments, because here you speak about good practices and success stories, etc., in countries where it is happening. There's many countries where it's not happening as well. And so if we do not get a standardized metric to measure, we will never know, and we will never be able to incentivize and even to push and lobby certain governments in order to engage in these activities as well.
I guess no questions. Everyone is tired, so thank you for being here and holding to the very last minute. Thanks a lot, and have a nice evening.